I'm using my phone because my computer video is like super bad. So
I do more stuff on my phone because it's way better. It's way better. Okay. I have to spray this down. That hair is not acceptable. BRB.
Hello and welcome to The Wedge. I'm your host, Dr. Joyce Del Rosario. This videocast highlights Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders working towards social justice. We call it The Wedge because Asian Americans are often wedged in the black and white binary conversations on race. We are tossed around as either model minorities or the perpetual foreigners who have the Kung flu. But really, API folks are positioned to help break the binary conversations to move us toward justice and equity for all people. The Wedge introduces Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are doing great things in their community. In this first season, we will focus on API pastors, practitioners, and academics who have invested themselves in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I hope you enjoy this series. This is why I invited you both on the same episode. One is you're both Korean American. I'll let you identify yourselves and kind of talk about yourselves. But what I really love is that you're both in the Bay Area, you're both Korean American, you both have very similar last names, but really you two are very different and do things very differently. And I really wanted to highlight that. Part of it is, I think Asian American, particularly women, get kind of pigeonholed into this monolithic, like this is the way that Koreans are, this is the way that Asians are. And I really wanted to highlight, you know what, you can even have really, really close names, but be completely different and be about the same things, but be very different in the way that we go about it. And so that's why I invited you both together. I'm really excited to have you here.
Well, not a strong start there. So my name is Erna, like Erna Living is how I try to help people to remember it. I grew up outside of Seattle, went to college in Southern California, and now I'm in the Bay Area. I recently left a job as an executive pastor at a church in the Bay, and am now focused all my time on a love passion project called Liberated Together, which is a space for women of color who are doing justice work to have space to actually have deep conversations with each other, since I don't think women of color automatically have solidarity, but we have really different experiences, marginalization and oppression, but we're so busy doing the heavy lifting in other spaces. We have very little room to really talk to each other and build solidarity with each other. That, and also it's a space to help us pursue justice in a more healthy and sustainable ways, not in this sort of like women of color, martyr yourself for the cause, but what is a way that centers our joy and healing and our community with each other. So that's what I've been working on for the last couple months.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm Erina. I say usually it's like Erica, but with an N, Erina. Erina Kim Eubanks, and I currently live in San Leandro, California, which is right just south of Oakland. And I am a pastor. I work at a church called Bethel Community Presbyterian Church. My husband and I co-pastor together, and we've been there just a little over a year now, doing a 3-year revitalization project and sort of trying to revive this older Presbyterian church and trying to build a meaningful community there. And I am married. My husband and I have 2 kids, a 3-year-old and a 10-month-old. So we've been keeping busy, trying to juggle pastoring together, parenting together, just living with each other. And trying to actually do some work in our city in San Leandro, where there's been a lot of stuff going on in regards to racial justice. So that's me in a nutshell.
And your kids are friggin' adorable. So cute. Anyway.
Thank you.
So this video cast is really my desire to highlight Asian Americans doing social justice work. And both of you have been doing this for a long time. And we don't have to just go first one, Erna and then Erina, however you want to talk about it. But I'm interested in, why does it matter to you? Why does racial justice matter to you? Why does Black Lives matter to you? Why?
I think for me, so much of my experience with race and racial justice, it's personal. And I think the work of dismantling white supremacy is for me because I have suffered under white supremacy. And it's also for my family. My husband is Black, my kids are mixed. We are living in a world that potentially, if we don't do this work, is not going to be friendly to my children and potentially deadly to them, to my husband, and even deadly to me in a different sort of way. So I think there's the personal piece of it. And I just really believe that I just believe in freedom, people living free and being able to live as free people, to tell their stories, to have their voices, to be seen and have dignity and worth in our society and in our communities. And I actually really believe that we're meant to live in community, in interdependence with one another, in mutual relationships, in equal relationships. And so much of the project of white supremacy is to erase that and to create hierarchy and to create a lack of community, to create systems that erase stories. So it's personal to me, and it's also just kind of like how I'm wired, what I value. I feel like I've just been this way since I was young, but also it's been an ongoing journey for me of my own family and building my own family, and also getting close to the stories of people who have really suffered and have really been silenced and traumatized by race, and really wanting to see that change. So,
yeah. Erna, any stories or any, just.
Yeah, it's fun to listen to you, Erina. I think for me, a lot of it has to do with belonging, or like my own experience of looking for a feeling of belonging. I think growing up outside of Seattle in the late 70s, not a mecca of diversity, fam. And I think I grew up in a very small Korean immigrant church, and that was a huge anchor. But I think by virtue of being biracial, there's just a little bit of like, I actually feel like I had a very positive experience for somebody of my generation of really being embraced by my Korean church and by my family in Korea. But in high school, I went to a Korean church camp, and I got all this teasing about being just half. And it didn't matter that I like spoke the language and went to Korea every summer. And I think, when I felt like, oh, this community that I think I belong to doesn't claim me, it really threw me for a loop. By just coincidence, I ended up going to a leadership camp like a week after that Korean church camp. And my roommate was a Black woman, young. Actually, she was in high school. She was a young girl. What were we in high school? Young women? What were we at 15? And I think what really meant so much to me about that experience was I felt like she and her group of friends embraced me and were like, oh, do you want to talk about race? Like, you want a frame to process what's going on? And they sort of gifted me like their framework. I think we didn't have the language back then, but I think we would have said she was very woke and had like a racial analysis on the world and an analysis of whiteness. And this was totally new to me. But that became a place of belonging. Like, I didn't feel on the outside, even though there was all these places where I'm like just a little Korean white girl in these like Black spaces. I think for me, where I approached justice, then it came from a place of when I was in need, people extended me a sense of belonging. And so when I became moved into ministry, I mean, when I heard theology that was like, Jesus cares about those on the margins and racial reconciliation, which was really kind of like radical language in the 90s, like who was doing racial reconciliation? Now we have like a lot of support, but in the 90s, it's a big deal. For me, I was like, okay, well, I really believe that. And then I could see, I was like, well, if we really believe that, who does not have a sense of belonging here? And it isn't just about saying you want them to belong. So I think there was a sense of understanding there's something in our system that makes folks feel on the outside, whether that be Asian American folks or Black folks or Latino folks. At that time, it was Latino, now Latinx folks. And I think then I started focusing in around more justice issues in my campus ministry work and Black campus ministries. And then I think in years of building relationship, realizing like there's something in this system, like pastoral care and interpersonal relationships is just not enough. I really think around the acquittal of George Zimmerman is when I really started to deepen an awareness that the theology I had was just not adequate. I didn't know, I couldn't put it into words, but I really hit a wall there. And I think that was the beginning of another journeying phase of how it's not enough to care. It's not enough to have a relationship. It's not enough to advocate. There's something else.
So what did that look like for both of you? What are you doing now? How are you living this liberated life now in a way? Yeah.
What are you doing? I don't know if I'm quite liberated yet, but I'm working on it.
That's fair. That's fair.
It's been an ongoing process and journey, obviously. And I was thinking about, I've been super, honestly, really blessed and privileged to have a lot of experiences of being proximate and having close relationships with people who were just very different from me, starting with like tutoring in juvenile hall when I was in college, and then like doing prison ministry and working in restorative justice. And I was thinking about all these experiences, and one of the most significant ones I realized for me was actually going to Ferguson. Erna, did you go to Ferguson too with InterVarsity? I don't know, but
no, I was there. Well, I was there in 2015, and I think you took the pilgrimage in 2016.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I think that was probably one of the more formative experiences for me in terms of the path I've taken in the last 5 years. And I think because it really brought to life the ways that white supremacy and racism, when we talk about it, it can be very abstract in a lot of ways, maybe this big, historic, systemic thing. And going to Ferguson made me realize the importance of place and proximity to like a particular group of people. Racism takes root in different communities and different places in that land, in the place of Ferguson. Like we went to the Cahokia Mountains and we acknowledged sort of the genocide of indigenous communities in that area. We went to the Canfield Apartments where Michael Brown lived and where the memorial was for him, and his family were there. And we went to the courthouse where, you know, enslaved Africans had been sold from those steps. We sat on those steps and we were there. We were in the courthouse where the Dred Scott decision was made. So all of those things, you start to realize that, you know, racism isn't just this out there thing. It takes, you know, specific forms in particular places and affects people in a very particular way. And the people in Ferguson had experienced racism in particular ways throughout their history, and getting close to some of the local leaders on the ground, people, names you might not ever hear, you know, people who might not have a national platform, but people who are on the ground, they're local activists there, T-Dub and Rika and Reverend Renita, getting to hear their stories. It just made me realize how much, for me, I had started kind of realizing I need a commitment to a local involvement, because racism takes such clear form in places and in people living in those places. And so for me now, a lot of my work pastoring in San Leandro and doing work in San Leandro is a commitment to the local work. San Leandro has an incredibly racist history. It was, there was a documentary that featured it as one of the most racist cities in America in the 1970s, the Suburban Wall. And so, and yet now, like, you know, they're like, oh, we're the city of kindness and we're so proud of our history and we're looking towards the future. And it's like, there has been no recognition of the history of racism here. And very clear, specific policies of restrictive covenants and redlining in San Leandro that you can easily look up and trace, and stories after stories after stories of people, Black folks in this community who try to buy housing here, face discrimination. There's a famous sort of artist named Brian Copeland who's done this whole one-man theater piece called Not a Genuine Black Man. And so there's a lot of that realization for me of the importance of local work in the ways that racism takes a particular form in the place that you live. And of course, it's there on a big scale, nationally, systemically, historically, it's there, but it becomes hard for me to know how to engage that. And so for me, my way of engaging has been more local and looking at kind of policies locally, dynamics locally, local government, city politics, looking at our city council members, calling them out on stuff, and working with people in a local way to address racism. And that's kind of been the focus of my work in the last few years. So that's
Nice.
me.
Yeah. Well, and I've had the honor of being at your church and kind of guest preaching a couple times, but it's not a huge church. It's not a church with like so many resources and so many, you know, things, but you're able to. So tell me about, like, what are you doing with what you have and who you have in your church?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just basic, what we would call discipleship work. I mean, I personally believe, my husband and I, who are co-pastors, we believe in the church. We believe in what the church is called to be. We believe that the church is called to be faithful witnesses that stand in sort of subversion of the empire. Like, that's what the church was. That's what Jesus enacted in the early church. And so we're trying to build a community like that really understands the call of Jesus and lives it out and is faithful to stand against power and to stand against oppression and to stand kind of in solidarity and alignment with those who are most marginalized in our communities. And so we do that, you know, through our liturgy. We do that, try to do that through our preaching in ways we can, but really it's just through building kind of a sense in people of their own relationship with God. And what
are you air quoting that?
I know, it's like this personalized, privatized relationship with God, and saying, hey, no, like, there is no such thing. Your relationship with God has implications for how you live in a place, how you vote, how you engage your neighbors, how you call the cops or don't call the cops, how you, how you speak in city council meetings, how you go into the stores and view people who are there. You know, it's just everything about how you live is impacted. And so we're just trying to help people understand the ways that their daily life should be a reflection of the values and the way of Jesus, and to know that it was a very subversive and sort of countercultural way that Jesus enacted. And some of that is, I mean, Erna, to what you're saying, a lot of that is also in belonging and building a community of belonging. We're trying to build an intergenerational and multi-ethnic community that is open and affirming. And, you know, it's like all those things, all those dynamics are complicated, but trying to really reorient people's understanding what spiritual family is, and saying this is actually a radical thing, to have a place where everyone belongs and everyone matters and their voice is heard. And we're trying to build that kind of space. So,
and just to clarify, you touched on a sort of a big theological thing of the personal relationship with God, which is a pretty evangelical way of seeing it. Also a very American individualized way of seeing things, of this is just me and God, and my responsibility is to no one else but, you know, that one relationship, versus a more community-centered, a more collectivist understanding of God. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out, because that was an important distinction that you made. Erna, you went a different direction.
I did, but I do just want to say, I really, as somebody who is in the Bay Area and knows Erina and Michael, I really love their commitment, the hyper-local commitment. I mean, particularly the murder of Stephen Taylor, I think, in that community, and the way they've engaged there as clergy, I think is so, it's needful. Especially, I think what's important in 2020 about deeply local engagement is so many folks feel like the work is done by like posting memes or like like a 120 character takedown of someone. And I feel like that's not how real transformation happens. And so I really just want to appreciate, and it's like revitalizing a church. That's not sexy. That's every day, like rebuild. Yeah.
It's calling 73-year-olds every week, and checking in on them. Like, it's dealing with buildings that have rats. Like, that's what it is. But, yeah.
I just want to name that, because I do think there's sort of a mythology out there right now about like justice work is sort of glamorous. And I'm like, everyone I know who's doing it, it's like, it's day-to-day, unseen, mundane labors of love, which have moments that get highlighted maybe right here. Oh, we're in this like video conversation. So it's like, this is like 40 minutes out of every day.
Yeah.
By nature of my master's program, which was with Indigenous folks, with Native American Christian folks, and it was a lot about decolonizing theology. I'd say a lot of my work now is helping create language and frameworks, not just about, I think there's a season of decolonizing where you're like doing a lot of critique of white evangelicalism. And I think that's necessary if you're trying to extricate yourself from it. But I think I'm more interested now at this point about like, there comes a point where it's like, you shouldn't talk about your ex-boyfriend anymore and you need to like build healthy, like new relationships. And I do who are come out of at some point. It's why I don't personally use the term like ex-evangelical, because I feel like it's like I wouldn't refer to myself as like, you know, Bobby's ex-girlfriend for like some, it's still centering over here versus really there's another way. There's a whole nother way. There's a whole nother way that it's been really helpful to me to like lean into the leadership of Indigenous folks, to lean into the leadership of Black women, and disabilities activist folks who are just like, I'm imagining a whole nother world. And so I think my work is with women of color to help them have the language, theology, but my work is less sort of deconstructing and fully helping them, you know, one-on-one coaching and in cohorts, like moving theology from something that's just in your head. Like one thing we'll do is after I teach, after anyone teaches, is stop and we'll do some breathing and go, where are you experiencing this theology in your body? Mm-hmm. Right? Like to move into theology isn't disembodied and just in your head. Often, and when I do coaching with women, they will talk about how, or with queer folks, they knew something was toxic to them in their bodies long before they could say it. And so I think to me, like the constructive work now is like help people trust that and have tools to fully understand where there's internalized patriarchy and misogyny and internalized homophobia that makes folks not able to listen to what God has put in them and be fully integrated.
And you're midway through, you do cohorts for all kinds of women, mm-hmm. but specifically Asian American cohorts right now, and you're midway through your second one, first and second one. Do you have any stories or anything about how that's impacting the Asian American women that you in Liberated Together?
Yeah. So yeah, the first cohort was for this cohort for women of color over 30, and that's mixed Indigenous, Latina, Black women. And then as COVID hit, I don't know if you guys know, there's this like global pandemic that's like and
it's not just made up. What?
Girl.
Oh, that's a whole other episode.
I know, I'm sorry.
Because I myself personally believe that it's real. So in shifting things to I noticed that in this season, in response to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that there was increased engagement, particularly by Asian Americans. Like when I was floating stuff out in 2015, 2016, it was a little bit like crickets, pushback, and then like the random Asian American brother who had like a lot to say about me. Always an Asian American brother got something to say. But I was like, I think there's a little more openness. So I just flew it up the flagpole. I was like, hey, Asian American women, like, you know, do you want to be in this learning space where we can talk about anti-Blackness in our own communities? And the interest was overwhelming. A groundswell of women responded. As we've been in that space, I would say, my observation is that Asian American women are incredibly hungry for a space that sees them. Mm-hmm. Not in sort of like, it's women coming out of white churches, women coming out of Asian American churches, like that gives them a robust understanding of their identity in the intersection of the complexity of being in the United States, where the Black-white binary is super real, where we experience patriarchy in all these spaces, and where there is just so much wanting to engage, but also part, I think, of how Asian American women in our first steps, we sort of self-erase in like a very cultural move. We're like, I want to engage. And part of how I'll engage is just how other people are. Because me trying to do it as an Asian American is confusing and seems like it makes people uncomfortable. And so trying to work through that, like, how can you engage truly, fully as yourself without erasing your presence as an Asian American woman? I think that, and it's complicated. It's complicated. I don't feel like I'm coming with like, here's all the answers, point 1, 2, 3. I feel like I'm just holding space. You and I are holding space to let the journey happen. And I feel like I'm just sort of watching and learning, because I think a lot of most Christian spaces for women are just so domestic and boring. And I just feel like so it's not that there isn't women's spaces. It's just that they're not they don't reflect the level of robust engagement that I feel like people are really longing for. I don't know if that makes sense, if that's too abstract, but that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, immediately I went to some women's type things that I've been to where there's a lot of floral swag involved.
There's always very themed. It's always like, isn't it just hard to like be the best wife to your husband, and it's so complicated. And I just feel like, sure, but also in 2020, like these women are like have these, you know, they're carrying a lot, like leadership in their churches and in their organizations and in their careers and in their families. They're not. Everyone needs a real spa retreat, but I don't think they're like, what I need Christian Spaces to give me is like something just so domesticated. Mm-hmm. You know, I think they want to know how to engage in a way that really brings change. But, you know, all Christianity is just so absurd when it comes to the female.
Well, I want to be cognizant of your time and honor your time. We've gone a bit over. But I did want to articulate this and also see if there's any wrap-up thoughts that you had. For what I learned in our conversation in just this little bit, as women of color, there comes a point where we hit the walls of patriarchy, we hit the walls of race, we hit the walls where we can no longer fully be ourselves and what we feel called to and what we feel purposed for, or however we want to say that. And so we are creating these new spaces and creating places for us to serve. And I think there's this like thing of doing social justice means that we have to liberate ourselves too, or be liberated to do the work that God's called us to do. I wanted to throw it back at you too and kind of let you close with, you know, whatever last words you'd like to say.
Well, I just want to go back to something Erna said about the erasure of Asian American women. And I think this is the thing I've been feeling a lot about binaries and for Asian Americans in the white-black binary, that there is no room for complexity. There's no room for holding differences. And I think I've been reflecting a lot on how Asian Americans either for survival, we have to perform whiteness or we perform blackness, right? And that's kind of what the binary does. It doesn't really give us a space for our own particular expression, and that erasure happens. And I think like I'm just really feeling the need for like honoring my own story and recognizing my own story and recognizing my own trauma that I hold in my body, and the ways that I think racism takes a very particular expression in Asian American communities, and in a variety of ways. Obviously, we're not a monolith, but I think it's different than what Black folks experience. And but it's not. That doesn't mean that we don't experience racism. And so I think I'm just really holding that and naming for myself and for my friends. Like when I see, even just seeing like some of my friends from college who are like totally living these privileged American dream model minority kind of lives. And I'm like, as I look at that, I could judge them and be like, well, why are you doing that? Why are you so comfortable? Why are you so complicit? And I'm starting to realize like, actually that's a trauma response too. You know, generations of war and colonialism and genocide and immigrant experience and anti-Asian sentiment in this country. That's the way that you've chosen to deal with that trauma, is to try to kind of assimilate in that way. And that is an erasure, you know, that's an erasure of your story, your history, your family. And so I feel like I'm just really trying to encourage Asian Americans to unpack their own stories, reflect on their stories more, reflect on the ways that kind of who they are matters too, and how do we hold the particularity of our experiences in this binary that tries to erase us, and note the ways that we too are impacted by racism. And so when we do this work, we're not just doing it for the Black community, we're doing it for us too, and our liberation is tied together. So yeah, anyway, that was a lot of things, but
well said though, well said.
Yeah, I second everything that Erna is saying. For me, you know, I always have everyone read Andy Smith's article on the 3 pillars of white supremacy. It's just the beginning of language where you understand the common shared enemy, and then what Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes does in her book, where to understand we have the shared enemy of white supremacy. It impacts each of our communities differently, but that's where it's common and there's room for complexity. And I really think those frameworks are really important. I find that Asian American women tend to do a thing where it's like, well, it's not as bad as what Black folks are experiencing, so it's nothing. And I feel like, no, that's not the place to do the work. Like, honor your story, like walk with Jesus in it, hold it, like, and understand that it didn't start the moment you landed here. When you know, like, especially as Korean, you know, since we're talking about a Korean American experience, you know, resistance, protest, that's a big part of the Korean story.
Yes.
It's not a Korean American story. And so I think we have to talk about the trauma that start. I mean, I feel like when people are like, Asian Americans are so quiet, I'm like, have you like met us though in our non-traumatized, non-marginalized state?
Yeah.
Loud people on this earth. And so I think kind of our story didn't start here, but when we are doing work here, we also understand the story we're stepping into, the settler colonial stepping into, the hundreds of years of violent anti-Blackness. And so I feel like we have to be able to hold it both, honoring our stories and understanding this stuff is about people dying. So also, we have to care about the fact that white supremacy murders people, and it murders Black and Indigenous people horrific ways.
Yes,
And
yes.
I feel like, but I'm not engaging that because I erase myself. I engage that because I believe in justice and liberation for everyone. And I will work on that for myself, for my community, for other Asian American women, and to catalyze us to do deeper, more robust, courageous work in dismantling the systems we've become a part of and being here. So,
Yep.
You too. Whenever you preach, both of you, I'm in it. So I need to find a new church, so this works. Well, I so much appreciate the work that both of you have been doing and are continuing to do. I appreciate both of you as women, as Asian Americans, as Koreans, as people, as all the great things that you are. And I just wanted to thank you for giving some time and sharing your story with us. So,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for doing this.
I'm going to screenshot everybody smile.
Yeah.